decade have come out in books before newspapers, if ever in newspapers. But because of the sort of things you can't get anywhere else because of our laws now, right? There were stories today about barring photographs of U.S. dead in Afghanistan by our good journalists who are embedded with our military, right? We are forbidden to see photos of torture. We are forbidden to see photos of, we are forbidden to see videos of torture that we know exist now, and others have already been destroyed. And, you know, I think there are two ways that we restore the rule of law and deter the continuation and repetition of some of these crimes and abuses. One is that we get some of these photos and videos out into the open. And the other is that we teach Americans to read. Because we've already got it all spelled out in black and white if we would sit down and read it. I think obviously getting the photos and videos out is much, much easier than teaching Americans to read, but I think both are important goals to take on. I live not far from Washington, D.C., and I do a lot of activism in Washington, D.C., and I took a break from activism to write a book. And far and away, the best group of people doing what needs to be done in Washington, D.C. go by the name of Code Pink.
Yeehaw!
They were there, and everyone from all the good organizations were there. Last Monday, we went to the White House to say, you know, we didn't think a 9th year in Afghanistan was really going to do the trick for us. That if we'd been through 8 of them, and we still hadn't even envisioned what the success would be, you know, could we really be sure a 9th year was going to do it? And we were standing there before they arrested us all for presuming to have First Amendment rights in a group larger than 25. There was someone who walked up to one of the police officers and asked for directions and said, you know, can you tell me how to find the military-industrial complex? And of course, it was behind them in the White House, primarily. That's the headquarters. That's where it's run. Wars are how presidents acquire more powers and strip us of more rights. And the White House is where the permanent war government runs its operations out of. I want to sort of paint a picture of a bigger concern than the current wars. Huge and disastrous and murderous as they are, and stripping us of the resources for everything else, I think there's something bigger. Raise your hand if you can tell me what Article 1 of our Constitution is about. One person. It's almost always one person, no matter where you go. What is it about, ma'am? Congress. The Constitution fits on one piece of paper. I have one in my wallet. I recommend getting one and reading it. And the first 60% of it is about the first branch of our government, the Congress. And every power that these guys could think of, they gave to the Congress. The powers to decide when and where we'll have wars. The powers to make every single law. The powers to raise and spend every dime. The powers to control immigration and money and justice below the Supreme Court. And everything you can think of, they gave to the Congress. Right? And Congress doesn't want it. Congress wants to give it away. But we should want Congress to want it because it's our only hope of having it ourselves indirectly through them. And I want this country to last for a while. I kind of want to think maybe we've got some years, maybe even decades, maybe even centuries ahead of us with the United States of America. And that would mean quite a few more presidents. Maybe presidents who haven't even been born yet are going to be president. And how they behave and what they do to this world is going to be determined above anything else by what they are permitted to do. And so the biggest consequence of the Bush-Cheney crime spree and the biggest consequence of Obama's presidency is going to be what powers they leave behind for every future president. And that's where there's a picture that's incredibly frightening, that the media is not talking about. You know, little blips and comments about czars and how we need the Patriot Act now, even though we used to hate it when it was a Republican Patriot Act. But generally, no comment whatsoever. And Congress is, if possible, less interested than the media. You know, if you read the Constitution, we have three branches. I mean, we have the Congress, then we have little Article 2 about the President, and a little teeny little Article 3 about the judicial branch. That's not what we have anymore. Now the two basic institutions of our government are parties. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party. That's where all loyalty is, not to branch of government. And we've moved to a place where the parties tell the president he can do whatever he wants. And so you have things like a proposal from Congressman Wexler of Florida and Barbara Lee of California to set up a commission through the House of Representatives to review presidential abuses and crimes of the past 8 years. Not a priority, not going anywhere. You have a bill to put a little bit of a check on claims of state secrets, you know, to deny information to a court because it's a state secret, to put a judicial review on that, not going anywhere. You have a bill to limit the abuse of signing statements, where a president signs a bill to a law and then writes a statement, I'm not going to obey this part of it. You have a bill that would expand the Gang of Eight, let more than just 8 Congress members have some hint at what's happening in our government in classified reports. You even have a bill with the backing of Congressman Alan Grayson that would allow the Congress to see, not to control, God forbid, the branch of our government that's supposed to raise and spend every dime, but just to see what the Federal Reserve does with our money, right? A bill that has a majority of Congress members already signed on as co-sponsors. Nancy Pelosi brings it up for a vote. It passes immediately, not bringing it up for a vote. And you start to talk about the two ways in which Congress can check the executive branch or the judicial branch, and it's almost scandalous. It's just completely off the radar screen. The first way, people probably remember hearing about checks and balances, right? Which is already misleading because there's no balance involved. Congress is supposed to run our country, and the executive is supposed to execute the will of Congress. But checks are important, and the president still got all of his, plus a bunch of blank ones from Congress. But Congress has two key powers. One is impeachments, and we went through 8 years of refusal to impeach the most impeachable offenses imaginable. We're now in a position where Congress this year impeached a judge. We've impeached lots of judges in our history. Impeached a judge for groping women. You know, now I'm not a supporter of groping women, but there's a judge, a lifetime appointment on the West Coast of this country, whose name is at the bottom of secret memos legalizing torture. There's even one legalizing aggressive war that nobody likes to talk about. Any future president can launch an aggressive war at his whim. That's legalized in a secret memo that's not secret anymore, by a guy named Jay Bybee. Jay Bybee, B-Y-B-E-E. And you can go to impeachbybee.org and read all about him. And the corporate media is all for impeaching him. All the stuffed-shirt human rights groups in Washington, they're all for impeaching him. But Congress won't do it. When you talk about this in the House of Representatives, the general feedback you get is Fox News wouldn't like it. We would be accused of going after a conservative judge, right? This is when John Conyers, when we worked hand in glove with John Conyers in 2005, 2006, when he was in the minority pretending like he cared, he wanted to push for restoration of the Constitution and the rule of law and the end of illegal wars. And to his credit, he never supported the illegal wars. But come 2007, 2008, you know, we sat in his office, and he told us Fox News wouldn't like it, and arrested us, and we went to jail. So we're in a situation where you can't impeach anyone if they belong to the executive branch or they ever did belong to the executive branch. Unless maybe they're a Democrat or maybe sex is involved. That's the only way you can have impeachment. And the other power that Congress used to have to check the other branches was called subpoena. And during the Congress that ended last year, you had dozens of subpoenas sent out. Condoleezza Rice, Dick Cheney, dozens of members of the executive branch who said, nah, God, I've got to shop for shoes that day. Go ahead without me. Oh, okay, never mind. Sorry we troubled you. And that's it. Just left hanging there. And so they asked the Justice Department to enforce these subpoenas against their partners in crime. And they say, no, I'm not going to do it. So they take the Justice Department to court, drag it out longer. But the subpoenas are never complied with. Then we come to the current Congress. In April, Senator Leahy looked at these torture memos and said, Mr. Bybee, would it be any inconvenience to come in and talk to the United States Senate? The thing in Washington, you might have heard of us. He says, nah, I don't feel like it. I think I've got to go golfing. And that's that. That's that. Let it go. Because the current Justice Department would not enforce the subpoenas any more than the old one. And Senator Leahy is terrified, as is everyone else on both sides of the hill, of enforcing a subpoena themselves. The one thing that's happened in this Congress, I mean, as far as I know, nobody's subpoenaed anybody in the executive branch, or formally thereof, or reissued any of the subpoenas hanging out there from the last Congress. The one thing that's happened has to do with Karl Rove. And the new White House counsel negotiated between the first branch of our government and a common thug and a Fox News pundit, I'm sorry to be redundant, partial compliance with a subpoena. Partial compliance. Testify in secret with your lawyer there, approve everything, publish the transcript later. You know, some topics are okay, some aren't, and that's that. So, who knows what? Raise your hand if you know what inherent contempt is. It is not the feeling in your stomach when Cheney comes on television. It's just something more legalistic, I think. For the better part of U.S. history, up until about 75 years ago, when a congressional committee was upset with someone, wanted them to come talk to them, and they didn't show up, they held them in inherent contempt, meaning that Congress has the inherent power to preserve its existence. This is how it was talked about. And they would literally hold someone in contempt in a jail cell on Capitol Hill until they testified to the satisfaction of the committee, which means more than, I do not recall, sir. You know, I do not recall, sir. No, actually satisfies the committee. And you look back and it looks sort of silly. It looks like a sort of a medieval state of mind where you have duels and you bring people in simply to apologize for offending Congress's dignity. Congress was thought of as something that had dignity. And it looks sort of silly. But they actually cared whether Congress continued to exist or not. And now they don't. Now they don't. Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren told us, you know, that old jail cell, we don't have that anymore, and the sergeant at arms is 65 years old. I wish we could help you. As some people in this room know, they have an entire Capitol Police force and a hill honeycombed with jail cells. And we've been in them. Karl Rove hasn't yet been in them. And every committee has this power. And unless they use it, we're lost. And unless they use impeachment, we're lost. And if you hold an impeachment hearing, you bring out whatever information and tapes and videos and photos and reports you want. Because when you say to the White House or anybody else, I want this for an impeachment hearing, they cannot say executive privilege. When Richard Nixon said, no, won't give that to you, executive privilege, they said, aha, there's another impeachable offense. In fact, what Richard Nixon was about to be impeached for when he left town was refusal to comply with an impeachment hearing. It is a privileged hearing. There is a value to starting one. So the powers, because Congress has this sort of voluntary impotence, here, take the power, we don't want it, we won't touch you, we won't impeach you no matter what you do, we won't enforce our subpoenas. The powers that have now moved to the White House, I think, include, and these would just be the highlights, the power to make laws, the power to make wars, the power to spend money, the power to make treaties without the Congress, the power to grant immunity for crimes, the power to operate in secrecy, the power to spy without a warrant, the power to detain without a charge, and the power to torture. On laws, we now have laws made with signing statements. You write a bill, comes to the president, he signs it, puts in a note, I'm not going to obey this part, or this part, and I want section A6 changed to be as follows. And now that's the law, and that's the way it's enforced, rather than as passed by Congress. And the new president, President Obama, comes in and says, you know, I'm only going to issue signing statements if I really, really have to. And I'm not going to throw out Bush's signing statements that changed hundreds of laws. I'm going to look at them case by case as they come up and decide if I like them or not. And he starts writing his own signing statements that alter laws in the same exact way. Not as many, not as egregious, but cementing in place that that's the way it's done, in a way that one administration alone could never do, in a way that tradition predicts the Supreme Court will see as establishing it as legal, because multiple administrations do it without pushback. You have laws made now with executive orders. Major policy decisions in our country just made with executive orders. And, you know, you have a new president come in and pick some signing statements and throw them out, and pick some executive orders and throw them out. And then the new president writes new signing statements and new executive orders. Presumably the next man or woman in that office will pick which ones he or she likes and throw the other ones out. What kind of system of law is that? We have laws now made primarily by the president dictating to Congress what to write in the first place. Right? Rahm Emanuel was up on Capitol Hill yesterday telling them what to write for health care. The president has been walking Congress through this disastrous health care debacle for months. And they ask him, Mr. President, couldn't you please order us a little more firmly? Couldn't you just write the whole thing for us? You know, that's what they want. What the citizens want. What a reversal of how it's supposed to work. And then you have the secret memos, right? And the new president comes in and says, no, I'm not going to prosecute these lawyers who wrote these memos that said this blatant crime will be legal. Because, you know, maybe they had a bad day. They didn't get a lot of sleep that night, and you gotta look forward. But what I am going to do, I'm going to launch an investigation into whether we should really investigate whether to consider prosecuting some of the low-ranking people who strayed from the illegal policies in the secret memos, which sets up a precedent that any future president can tell a lawyer to write a secret memo legalizing a blatant crime, and it is legal. And if you can figure out anything that a president couldn't do then, you're smarter than I am. The power to make wars. We now don't declare wars. We get vague authorizations to use force, don't comply with the terms of them, send a pack of lies in a report to Congress, continue the occupations indefinitely when any relationship to the original authorization is lost, fund them with monies that had been appropriated for other things, employ mercenaries out of congressional oversight and out from under any rule of law, send drones into countries that we are not officially at war with in any sense, and it's all presidential power. We have now a larger military budget than we ever had when Bush and Cheney were in office. We have now more troops in the field in Iraq and Afghanistan combined than we ever had when Bush and Cheney were in office. And we have an empire of bases in more countries than we ever had when Bush and Cheney were in office. This ain't change I believe in. Sorry to tell you. This is not the direction we should be moving. Spending money is maybe the most important power in Congress. And this starts in the House of Representatives, and the Senate has to follow. Usually the House chooses to follow the Senate because the Senate is always worse on everything, and we always want the worst possible outcome. But on spending, the House has to start it, even though they get around that and have the Senate started. Well, Bush took money that had been appropriated for Afghanistan and used it to secretly begin the invasion of Iraq before getting any sort of authorization whatsoever. Nobody said a word. Everybody knew. We have massive secret budgets under the control of the president, and we have Bush declare that he could move monies into a secret budget and then use them as he saw fit. We have bailouts for bankers opposed by 90% of Americans. Happened under Bush and happened under Obama and under those Congresses in the exact same way, opposed by over 90% of us. And again, Congress isn't even allowed to know who's getting the money, where it's coming from, what's happening with it. And Congressman Grayson has been pushing that as hard as anyone else, along with the Republican Ron Paul, who put in the bill. It's a bipartisan bill with lots of Republicans and Democrats on it and a majority. But the party leadership that controls the House won't bring it up for a vote. Last Tuesday, the day after a lot of us went to the White House and opposed the war and said, we're here to speak for a majority of Americans, look at the polls, and we went to jail, the leaders of the two parties went to the White House. And according to Senator Reid's account, said, Mr. President, you want to escalate a war or not? That should be up to you. We've got your back. It's a blank check. You tell us how much money you need. You've got it. Don't worry about it. That's unconstitutional. That's absolutely unconstitutional and disgraceful. But there was a guy in the meeting named David Obey. Anybody know who he is? He's a what? Yeah, he's a congressman from Wisconsin, which is near Ohio, and he is the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. This is the committee that the bills to pay for things go through. A couple of years ago, a friend of ours who's a military mother, whose son had been to Iraq twice at that point, and had tried suicide a half dozen times, and was going to Iraq a third time, and the VA wouldn't help him. She runs into David Obey in the hallway, and he screams at her and calls us all idiot liberals for suggesting that maybe if he really opposes this war that he says he opposes, he should stop funding it, since he's in charge of the bills that fund it. No, I'm going to end this war by funding it. How'd that work out? On Thursday of last week, he puts out a statement in which he pretty much joins us idiot liberals and says, I don't think escalating a war in Afghanistan makes any sense at all. And as an appropriator, he capitalizes appropriator. He now begins talking as if support the troops, which was his whole excuse for helplessly funding wars that he opposed. He now talks as if support the troops means give some thought to whether to spend the money to send them off to kill and die for no good reason. That's an incredible turnaround. That has to be encouraged. And in June, and of course he voted for the same day for the so-called defense bill with another $120 million for the wars. But the escalation is a different matter. And if Obama proceeds with this escalation, he's not been given money for that. And he's going to run out of money quick, even if Congress doesn't speak up against it. And they're going to need another supplemental by spring at the latest. So this is where we can put our focus. But in June, we had one. We had one of these supplemental bills that we were never going to have anymore, because they're going to put the war money in the regular budget and be honest about it. Well, they're not even doing that. They passed a law this year in Congress that says for anything we spend money on, you got to pay as you go. You want health care or schools or roads or anything, you got to raise taxes to pay for it. You got to take the money from somewhere else to pay for it. We got to have the books straight, except for the bankers and the wars, which are the big expenses. Those are not under the pay-go system. So even if they're in the same bill, they're still cheating. But we also still have the supplementals, right? First we had the massive, biggest military bill in the history of the planet because we weren't going to have supplementals. Then we had a supplemental that you were supposed to vote for because it was the last one, whatever that meant. Then you had another big military bill. Now we're going to have another big supplemental. And in June, we had 51 Democrats in the House vote no. I'm going to go home and tell my constituents I voted no. They're going to love me. And then it went to the Senate, and they put in this IMF, essentially bailout for East European bankers. And then it comes back to the House. And the Republicans, in their own twisted analysis, they don't like Europeans. They oppose the bill now. And every single Republican is going to vote no. So if those 51 Democrats just vote no again, like they already did, it dies. So we have a fight for about a week. We have all the peace groups working together. We have a list on a blog called Firedog Lake where we're keeping a whip list. This is not like Dick Cheney's enemies. This is like who we're going to count on to vote no, who has made a commitment publicly to vote no. And we have the cabinet secretaries and the president and generals and the leadership in the Congress do nothing for a week except threaten and bribe people. Right? My congressman got over $1 million from the Democratic Party in Washington in the last 2 weeks and won by less than a percentage point. He wanted to vote one way. He voted the other way. His constituents wanted him to vote one way. His party leaders forced him to vote the other way. They didn't force him. He went along. But then after he did it, they put ads on the radio for him. They sent Steny Hoyer and Van Jones down to do press events with him with no news to announce. They said, you can keep your seat. Well, we had this kind of fight, and they're still paying back the threats and bribes. And we held on. We needed 39, and we held on to 30. And among those 30, there was a guy from Florida named Alan Grayson. He voted no. He voted no when it actually mattered. When if 9 more people had voted no, it would have stopped it. That's what we need. The power to make treaties. Bush and Maliki, the occupied government of Iraq, the puppet government of Iraq, made a treaty for 3 years of war. Senator Biden, I forget what he's doing now, but the guy named Biden, he puts in a bill that says we aren't going to fund the occupation of Iraq unless the Senate gets to vote the treaty up or down. Senator Obama's talking more or less the same way. Now, you move into the White House, all of a sudden you've got no legal cover for the illegal occupation of Iraq except this treaty. And your generals are openly announcing that you're not going to comply with it. You're already not complying with it, but the big demand is everybody out by the end of 2011. They're openly defying that. They're building cities that they call bases in Iraq. And it's hard for Congress to say comply with this treaty. They weren't even asked to approve it in the first place. And they went along with it. And now it's the treaty you go by. And the peace activists who said, oh, goody, the war ends, just 3 more years and it ends, should sit down with some Native Americans and talk about treaties. Because I hate to break it to you, there's going to be another treaty. And there's going to be treaties like this one in other countries. The power of pardon is something the president is supposed to have. Somebody's convicted of a crime and you can pardon him. Or you can pre-pardon him before he gets convicted, as Ford did with Nixon. Or you can mass pardon people to heal the country after a war or after a bunch of resistors went to Canada to avoid a war or whatever. But when Bush was suspected of planning what Cheney now says he was demanding, that he pardoned people for crimes he himself ordered committed. Now that's pushing it. And there was a lot of pushback by all of us, by Congressman Gerald Nadler and others in the Congress. But even Nadler and even the leaders on this said that Bush could do that if he chose to. But that sort of twisted interpretation of our Constitution has to be dealt with. But what Bush did do, and what Obama is doing, is arguably far worse. And that is they are giving immunity to people without telling us their names and without showing us the crimes that were committed. We know massive crimes have been committed. In the warrantless spying and so forth, they now tell us that for purposes of denying information to the public about what their government is doing, telephone companies are part of the executive branch of our government. Right? They are appealing and reappealing cases that would reveal anything about the warrantless spying or the torture They have threatened to cut off intelligence sharing with the United Kingdom if they leak out anything about the torture. They are appealing the ruling that says that that the FBI has to show us Dick Cheney's transcript when he was interviewed about the time when he leaked the name of an undercover CIA agent. We know Cheney did it. We know the FBI interviewed him and wrote down what he said. A court has ordered that information released, and Obama's fighting it tooth and nail. Why would you fight so hard to protect the other team? Unless, maybe Michael Moore's movies got it right. Maybe one team is the people with all the power, and the other team is the rest of us. Then it makes a little bit of sense. The power to torture is the one where everybody thinks we got that one taken care of. Even though we're not prosecuting any of the torturers, we're not deterring it for the future. It's ongoing in the places where our wars are, and people know that they'll get a slap on the wrist at the most. They won't be prosecuted. Even so, we think we can put this behind us because the president has said we don't torture. Even though the last president said we don't torture, but we didn't believe him. And yet, the director of the CIA, Leon Panetta, White House advisor David Axelrod, have both made absolutely clear in televised interviews that they believe the president keeps the power to torture. He's just choosing not to use it right now. That means he could choose to use it. That means the next guy could choose to use it. That means 20 years from now somebody could choose to use it. If it's a policy choice, and you're choosing not to use it, somebody else can choose to use it. Right? And if you take something that's a felony and you make it a policy choice, what's to stop the next guy from taking some other felony and making that one into a policy choice? Right? Through this whole charade of should Congress ban torture? Can the president undo that with a signing statement? Should Congress ban torture again? Should we make an exception for the CIA because they're the good torturers? Throughout all that nonsense, torture was illegal. In any way, shape, or form, any act of complicity in torture was a felony. It's been in the U.S. Code since Clinton was president, enforcing a treaty signed by Ronald Reagan. Habeas corpus is the one right that shows up in our Constitution. The one where you'll recall a guy named Alberto Gonzalez went and testified that, well, the Constitution says you can't take it away from somebody. It doesn't say they had it to begin with. Well, habeas corpus, been expanding for 800 years. The right not to be detained without charge, put in prison, no lawyer, no communication, no trial, just held. Well, Bush and Cheney got rid of that one. And Obama went and stood in front of the Constitution at the National Archives and got rid of it for good. He said, we're going to have a formal program of preventive detention. This is cementing something in place that one administration alone couldn't do, right? Habeas corpus is a suicide prevention line. The people in Guantanamo who have killed themselves because they've been locked up without charge, without a lawyer, without a trial, without a future, without hope, right? We're supposed to be the land of hope, I think somebody said. And the people you have to force feed in our death camps. You have to force feed because they don't have habeas corpus, and neither do we. Neither do we. This goes for Americans. White Americans, Christian Americans, English-speaking Americans. It goes for everybody. You take away rights for some group you despise. You take them away for everybody. Now, our president now is clearly a nicer guy than most of our Congress members. A lot of us don't like our Congress members very much. But doesn't change the fact that for over 2 centuries it's been almost impossible to influence a president. It doesn't matter who the president was. It was almost impossible to influence him. Now a president takes 10 times the money of any senator, is corrupted by the corporate media night and day, year in, year out. He can ignore whole regions of the country, not even come to your state unless you're a good swing state like this one, or if you schedule your primaries wrong. He can not be approached He's got the Secret Service around him. All right? You cannot influence him. When Congress went and said, you want to escalate in Afghanistan, go ahead, he said, I was going to ignore you guys anyway. And I'm going to ignore the American public too. Oh, thank you for ignoring us, Mr. President. It's the reaction they expect when they say that I'm going to ignore public opinion polls and do what's right for the nation. Oh, thank you for ignoring us. We didn't want a democracy. We wanted, a guy who does what's right for our nation. Right? It's the most anti-democratic attitude imaginable. And we favored, as a majority, we favored the war in Afghanistan before the most recent election, but we don't now. We have to be represented for who we are now. And we can't take our views and impose them on a president. We tried, he locked us up. Well, senators are almost as hard to read. I know Code Pink and other groups here have influenced your senators somewhat. But in the broad scheme of things, it is almost impossible on the big issues to control senators. And you don't have to. Because if you want to pass a bill, you need both houses and you need the president. But if you want to stop a bad bill, if you want to subpoena somebody, or if you want to impeach somebody, you only need the House. And with the House, we have a fighting chance. We really do. Some of them are a lot more hopeless than the guy whose district we're in right here. But you can get to any of them. A small group of people can get to any of them. Politely, less politely, through the local media, through phone calls, emails, faxes, postcards, presents, and through going there and sitting down and not leaving. Just go sit in your Congress member's district office. Be trained, be prepared, be informed, know your rights, know if it's a federal building, what they can charge you with, and so on. But it's not hard, and it's fun, and it's enjoyable. I know I'm preaching to the choir with at least half this room, but you've got to do it. You go there and you sit. And if you're going there for health care, you cough a lot. And you don't leave. You bring polls, you bring polling of where the people in your district are, and you don't leave until you have a commitment to represent the majority and a commitment where you can go back and say he did it, yes or no. Not he's committed to agree with us in his heart of hearts and he's transparent and wants to have dinner with us. No, a commitment where you can say, did he do it or not? Right? So, I think it would be a smart experiment to try to just go a week. People like you who are politically interested and active and engaged, try to go a week without thinking about the president. Just don't think about it. I think it would be hugely valuable. And start focusing on where we can make a difference. I mean, I voted for Barack Obama. Virginia voted for the less racist of the two candidates for the first time in history. And it was a black guy. It's good for Virginia. It helps in Virginia. But then to fantasize that alone changes something in Washington. And then to behave as if we had a coup. Just because we had a coup in 2000, and Florida had a little something to do with it, we had a coup in 2004, we had an election in 2008. And after an election, you don't sit home. After an election, you do what Obama's told you to do. You get out there and tell them how to represent you and force them to represent you. It's not disrespectful. It's your part of the bargain. It's failing to treat them as dictators, which is how you're treating someone when you sit home. Let them run the country. Because, the health insurance companies, the health industry, that's got 6 lobbyists per Congress member, you think they stayed home for a while and see what happens? You stay home for 1 day this round, and you got Rahm Emanuel in office, in the White House, Did you skip that first day? Because we could have used some pushback in those first hours. So it's not that we don't need elections. It's not that elections aren't important. It's not that you don't vote for the better of 2 candidates. It's that you shouldn't expect that to be more than 2% of your work as an engaged citizen, and you shouldn't expect that alone to do any good, and you shouldn't be disappointed when it doesn't. You shouldn't go through that whole cycle of fantasy and then despair. You just skip that. And I hope to God we can skip it next time. When you elect some people who might be better, that's when you invest and fund and get active and engaged and push because you might get something done. Instead, we dismantled the peace movement. It's the exact opposite of how you should behave. I think it's exciting to be in a district with a congressman who is starting to excite people, like Alan Grayson, right? Because I think it's a different strategy from the usual one of don't turn anybody off. Try like they're fighting, and he's critiquing in the Senate, putting all their focus on getting one Republican onto a health care bill, so that they can then say it's bipartisan and not be blamed for what a lousy piece of crap it is. But most Democratic candidates put all their focus on trying to get 3 or 4 Republicans to vote for them and avoiding offending any Republicans, right? Well, meanwhile, half the electorate doesn't vote at all because they're not interested. Right? So to actually excite people and get people to volunteer, get out in the streets and sign up new voters and turn out more people and maybe even win over some Republicans by showing that you've got the nerve to fight for things, maybe even showing some leadership and arguing for some positions that some people might actually disagree with, is a different strategy. You know, there are Congress members like Dennis Kucinich, who I've worked for, who are very different from the rest of the Congress members, and yet they keep getting reelected. And the other ones are afraid to act that way because they won't get reelected. But they will. They will. And Alan Grayson will. And, you know, that being said, I want to get out of this sort of telephone survey mentality of, do you approve of this guy or do you disapprove of this guy? Right? This is not about a team or a religion or loyalty or faith. These are not our friends. These are our representatives. We will agree with them on many things and disagree with them on many things. But we have to praise them. We have to criticize them. We have to pressure them to do more. So if Alan Grayson is doing the right thing on the Federal Reserve, we got to cheer for him. If he's doing the right thing on the war funding, we got to cheer for him. And if he's given us straight talk about Republicans that everybody else is too horrified to speak up on, we got to thank him and praise him. But you know what? The Republicans are completely irrelevant and have been completely voted out of power. We've given the Democrats huge majorities in both houses and the White House. They're choosing to do nothing with it. They're going out of their way to find some way to blame the Republicans. They're keeping the filibuster rule in place. They're pretending the Republicans are filibustering. It's not even clear they are. There's at least one Democrat joining it to make sure they can pretend it's happening. They're fighting to get one Republican to sponsor a bill. And to his credit, Grayson has criticized this. But, you know, going out and bashing the Republicans is not my top priority. It doesn't save a single life. Getting the Democrats who have all the power in Washington to do something with it is at the top of my agenda. And when they fail, they're going to put the Republicans back in power whether you bash them or not, because the Democrats are going to have done nothing with the power that they held. And I got to tell you, and I got to tell you, on health care, Congressman Wexler is the only Floridian who's on the new quick list that we've got at firedoglake.com of who's committed to vote no on the most awful health care bills that don't even have this token public option redeeming feature in this bailout for the unhealth industry. Only Congressman Wexler, not Congressman Grayson. And Congressman Grayson signed a letter to Chairman Waxman urging him to insert the president's deal with the pharmaceutical companies to make sure they made millions off our suffering. And then the pharmaceutical companies ran ads for Congressman Grayson. When somebody does something right, you've got to thank them and encourage them. When they do something wrong, you've got to hold them accountable for it, even if it's the same guy. No matter what party he's in or not in. So here's what, if I lived here and I was working with you guys and we were getting a group together and planning to go lobby Congressman Grayson, as I know you already do, I would say put your name on that list on firedoglake.com that at a bare minimum you're going to vote no on the worst of the worst health care bills. You can still vote no, even if there's some pretense of a public option in there, but for God's sake, put your name on there. What are you waiting for? Number two, make a public commitment that you will vote no on money for wars, or at least on money for escalation in Afghanistan, and let us start building a list with your name at the top and help us get 20, 30, 50, 100 people on that list. And number 3, when Alberto Gonzalez left town, we did that. I was with a bunch of code pinkers at the gate as he left, celebrating and wishing him a long voyage and no return to Washington, D.C. But why did he leave town? Because one congressman from Washington State, who was not a leader, put in a one-sentence bill that said, the House Judiciary Committee shall consider whether Alberto Gonzalez has committed impeachable offenses. And Congress members were signing on it over summer break, 2008, and more signing on, and he quits and leaves. He quits and leaves. Maybe it was 2007. It was one of those summers. And they didn't want an impeachment hearing. They didn't want him talking about Bush and Cheney. They didn't want all of that in front of the cameras. They didn't want people going to jail when they start ratting each other out. Congress was using some muscle, and Alberto Gonzalez left. As happens with the vast majority of impeachment efforts, we got what we wanted without even having to do the impeachment. If Congressman Grayson tomorrow were to put in a one-sentence bill that said the House Judiciary Committee shall consider whether Judge Jay Bybee has committed impeachable offenses, the flood of money and support is going to dwarf anything he's seen from bad-mouthing the Republicans. He's going to be a hero internationally. He's going to be the leader of the United States Congress. When Congressman Wexler pushed for the impeachment of Dick Cheney, he was challenging his party and he was challenging his committee chairman. Almost unheard of. Almost unheard of. And he would go out to public events and the rooms would be overflowing. People couldn't fit in and they're all cheering for him like he's a god. And he's completely shocked. And he says, maybe there's something to this impeachment stuff. Of course there is. It's been popular with the American public for 225 years. We didn't want Clinton impeached because it wasn't an impeachable offense. We love seeing people impeached and prosecuted and held to the account of the rule of law like the rest of us have to be when they have done something wrong. And Congressman Wexler was shocked. Congressman Grayson would be shocked if he or any other Congress member from Florida or anywhere else were to put in that one-sentence bill. And I would ask him, why in the world not? A lot of people, I want to open this up for discussion and questions, but, I want to sort of preemptively address at least one question that I always get, which is essentially, shouldn't we all give up and crawl under our beds with a gun? And I'm still going to get it, even though I preemptively answer it, but here's my answer. I have two basic answers. One, we are succeeding incredibly, and you have no idea because your television doesn't tell you, and your newspaper certainly doesn't tell you. And when Alberto Gonzalez left town, that's because we forced him out. When the Army recently announced they're not going to put these shoot-em-up real weapon video game parks in shopping malls across the country, that's because we so effectively protested the one they put in Philadelphia. When the president said he's not going to put a base in the Czech Republic, and the press said, well, that's because Russia wouldn't like it. Nobody told you that a handful of citizens in the Czech Republic made it impossible, went on hunger strikes, went in the media, passed local resolutions, took 130 mayors to the Capitol, passed a bill, overthrew a government, made it impossible to put it there. A friend of mine from Iraq Vets Against the War was just in Japan lobbying successfully, and Japan is going to pull out all support for the occupation of Afghanistan. They're not going to tell you, here's the day when you have now stopped an attack on Iran. We've done it every day for years now. We exposed the lies that took us into Iraq. They've used the same lies. Newsweek last week, nuclear explosion on the cover. Be afraid of Iran. And the 90% of the American people are refusing to be afraid of Iran. We did that. If you look at the polls of where the American public stands on all the issues we care about, we are huge majorities. Not in every district, but across the country. Nationally, we are huge majorities. On peace and justice and energy, on health care. And we think often that we're a fringe minority because our televisions keep telling us that. So we have to keep telling ourselves how powerful we are. The other answer I like to give is, why, for God's sake, does it matter if we're about to win or not? Do we not have a moral responsibility to fight as effectively as we know how for what has to be fought for until we die and let others take up the fight and carry on? The people most responsible for giving women the right to vote died without seeing women get the right to vote. The people most responsible for ending slavery died without seeing slavery end. You have to fight for generations. It's not, I know we can't watch something that's longer than 90 seconds. We lose our focus. But we have to sort of start to think in longer terms. So I want to close with a quote that I put with a few other quotes at the front of this book and see what you think. And this is from a guy named I.F. Stone. The only kinds of fights worth fighting are those you are going to lose. Because somebody has to fight them and lose and lose and lose until someday somebody who believes as you do wins. In order for somebody to win an important major fight 100 years hence, a lot of other people have got to be willing, for the sheer fun and joy of it, to go right ahead and fight, knowing you're going to lose. You mustn't feel like a martyr. You've got to enjoy it.